from the CyberHub bunker and studio. You're tuning in to the CyberHub podcast, Tech Corner. And now, join me in welcoming your host and CISO, James Azar.
All right, folks, RSA 2021, we are still virtual. Another session by our friends over at Centrify is coming right up. But before we do that, please make sure to subscribe. If you haven't subscribed and it's your first time tuning into our podcast, you want to subscribe. We're putting out a lot of great content for RSA, but even beyond RSA, we put out a bunch of great content here at the CyberHub podcast. And you can go and tune into our CISO Talk podcast, where you can hear a conversation between myself and one of my peers, a CISO, talking about some of the latest and greatest challenges that we are overcoming in our industry. So make sure to tune in to that. RSA still virtual. Our next session by Centrify here is the Modern Privilege Access Management. Just the Vault is not enough. It's by Brad Shewmake and Tony Goulding. So you're going to want to check that out. It's coming up right now. So stay tuned. Here we go. Let's kick it over to our friends over at Centrify. Brad, Tony.
Hi, we're at RSA Conference 2021. I'm Brad Shewmake, the head of corporate communications at Centrify.
And I'm Tony Goulding. I'm a cybersecurity evangelist with Centrify.
All right, and we're here today to talk about a topic that's very important when it comes to cybersecurity, which is modern privileged access management. And as a follow-on question to that is a password vault enough? So, Tony, let's just get right to it. I'm just going to ask the obvious question, right? So when most people think of privileged access management, or PAM, they think of password vaulting. And are they wrong?
No, they're not wrong. I mean, a password vault is a core element of a modern, robust privileged access management solution. I like to think of it as being two sides to the PAM coin. So you've got vaulting on one side, but you've also got privilege elevation on the other side. They're both equally important. They both have their own role to play in terms of protecting access to your systems and your data. On the one side of the coin is the vault. And for many organizations, that's kind of an easy on-ramp to PAM. And so they will acquire a vault, and they'll use that to vault away their privileged accounts. And those privileged accounts are the key elements here. They're the keys to the kingdom. That's what all of the attackers are looking to compromise, so they can get into your system and hunt around and find stuff that they can monetize. So the vault is a critical element for sure. It's that one side of the PAM coin. But then you've got the other side of the PAM coin, and that's privilege elevation. Privilege elevation has a slightly different role to play, but it's equally important, and it will help mitigate more of your risk. So what that does is it really protects down at the machine level. It means that what you're doing is you're logging into those systems as yourself, not with a privileged account, because remember, they're vaulted. We don't want to touch those. You're logging in as yourself with minimum rights. It's a least privilege access control model. Once you're logged in, when you need to do something with privilege, legitimately, we do what's called privilege elevation. So that's all about granting those additional rights to the user just in time, only when needed. So those are both sides of the PAM coin, and they're both very critical for best practices like zero trust and zero standing privileges.
Right, okay, so yeah, you just mentioned two pretty important buzz phrases there that have been, a lot of people talk about them when they talk about privileged access management in the last few years especially. So let's talk about zero standing privileges and about zero trust. So what are some of the best practices around those concepts when it comes to PAM?
So zero trust has been around for a while, and zero standing privileges is a concept that I guess Gartner has been championing for quite some time now. And they're all really trying to do the same thing, which is take those privileged accounts, the keys to the kingdom, off the playing field. We don't want them to be exposed, because that's what the hackers are looking for. If they get a hold of them, it could be game over. So we want to protect those things. Zero trust and zero standing privileges are not products. They're concepts, they're strategies, they're models for how you might go about doing privileged access management. And one of the things that they kind of both rely upon is something I mentioned in the previous question, which is least privilege, right? Without least privilege, you cannot really achieve a zero standing privilege model or zero trust. So with least privilege, if I'm an administrator, I should be using my own individual account that has minimum rights. Again, only when I need those extra privileges should I be granted them just in time, when required, but for a minimum amount of time. And that's really what aligns with this concept of zero trust. I shouldn't be trusted with the keys to the kingdom out of the gate all the time. I should only get them when I legitimately need them.
All right, so let's spend some time focusing a little bit on each side of the PAM coin, right? So vaulting. So what do a lot of people not get right about password vaulting?
So I think for many people, password vaulting has been a kind of a product that's been acquired because of an audit finding. So you may find an auditor comes in and looks at your IT landscape and says, there's all these privileged accounts, especially if you're in a regulated industry, there's all these privileged accounts. Are you properly managing them? And if you get dinged on that, if they call you out and say, well, you're not really protecting them properly, then an obvious on-ramp to doing that might be a vault, because the vaults are relatively straightforward compared to, say, privilege elevation. So they get a vault. And with the vault, what they're doing is they're taking those privileged accounts and they're storing them in the vault. One of the challenges, though, is that maybe they're not really applying a rigor to how those are used going forward. So it's okay that they're putting them in a vault where they can be protected, but then typically they'll allow their administrators to just log in at any time, check those passwords out, and then camp out all day as root or administrator. So, you haven't really cut down on that attack surface. They're still around, they're still being used, and they're still at risk. So the vault does have its role, right? You still want to vault these things away. You still want to put some rigor and some security around their use and add policies for who can do that. So that's vaulting. Should I go into the privilege elevation?
No. First, before we do that, let me ask a question that it seems like the answer should be obvious, but maybe it's not. So does password vaulting protect the target?
Good question. So when I look at password vaulting, again, I look at this and maybe a little bit naively as a glorified database to a large degree. It's for storing passwords, shared privileged account passwords. And if I was an administrator, I might go to the vault, let's say legitimately, and check out that password. And then once I've checked it out, technically the vault is now out of the picture. I'm using that then to go to the server and to log in as root or as administrator. So the vault has a very specific role to play in that. It's checking these passwords out, handing them over, and then it steps out of the way. So it's not really protecting the target, it's protecting those privileged accounts. Now, on the flip side of the PAM coin, as I mentioned earlier, is privilege elevation. Privilege elevation really happens on the host machine itself. Now, remember, your business-critical data tends to live on the host. That's what you're ultimately trying to protect. So one of the things we want to do in privileged access management is allow that machine, that server, to protect itself. With privilege elevation, we're giving it the ability to do that. In other words, if I knock on the front door and say, I've got this quote-unquote legitimate ID and password, we want the machine to be able to look at that, validate the password, and also say, well, is it really you? Is it really Tony, or is it somebody masquerading as Tony, and they've compromised that account? That is giving the machine the ability to sort of protect itself. And then further, when I'm on there and I want to do something with privilege, then this machine wants to know that I'm only going to hand over these privileges if I'm fairly convinced that this is a legitimate user that's using those credentials. So again, two sides to the PAM coin. The vault is more concerned around protecting those privileged account passwords. Privilege elevation side of the coin is really down at the machine level, where we're allowing that machine to have more control over protecting itself.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've talked about the passwords secured in a password vault. We've talked about the machines being able to protect themselves.
Yep.
So now, where do identities come into play? Because how do we know that these machines are being accessed by a legitimate user and not a threat actor?
Right. So I guess the first obvious thing is identities are necessary for humans to authenticate to systems, for systems to authenticate to systems, for in the cloud, for applications and services to communicate with each other. We need identities, because tied to those identities are going to be the privileges that we all need to do our jobs. So I guess that's the first point. But again, if I go back to that example of I go directly to the server and I'm trying to log in, how does the server know that I'm legitimate? So obviously the very first thing is, am I presenting a credential, an ID and a password typically, that is legitimate? So on the server itself with a piece of PAM software will talk to, let's say, Active Directory and say, hey, this user just presented these credentials. Are they legitimate? And AD will respond and say yes or no, basically. And if it's yes, then we can at least progress to the next stage. Now, a more advanced privileged access management solution would then potentially look at context for the user. Context may be around things like, is it a typical time of day or day of week? Is it an IP address that the user's workstation is using that's within the corporate IP address range? Is it a trusted device? Does it have a cookie on it that maybe our PAM solution has put on there? So using that context, we can better determine, is this Tony, or is this at 2 a.m. on a Sunday morning coming from Estonia or something like that, which may be a little bit more risky. And using that, we can determine, do we want to let him through? Do we want to stop him from coming through? Or perhaps do we want to prompt for a second factor of authentication, get additional proof from Tony using a push notification to his mobile phone, for example, to determine if that really is Tony, because presumably if someone is in Estonia, they don't have my phone. They may have my credential, but they don't necessarily have my phone. So it's using techniques, especially like MFA, adaptive MFA with context, as I just mentioned, that we can better enable that machine to verify that this legitimate credential is actually being used by the legitimate owner of that credential.
Got it. Okay, so now at the beginning of that section, you mentioned cloud. And a lot of the cloud providers offer some kind of IAM, identity access management, or privilege access management capabilities.
Right.
So what are some of the potential downsides or challenges of using those built-in tools?
Right. So I guess we're talking about cloud providers like AWS, Amazon Web Services, and Microsoft Azure, and Google, et cetera. So, I mean, these are all ecosystems, contained ecosystems in their own right. So it's really not surprising that, any vendor that has an ecosystem, whether it's an application-based or a platform-based, such as AWS, they're going to provide their customers with tools to help them better secure their environments. Hence, in AWS, for example, you have IAM services. So you can create local users, you can create groups, you can create permissions, et cetera. So it makes perfect sense that you're going to find that. However, from a privileged access management perspective, these tools are somewhat limited in what they can do. In actual fact, when we're talking about mitigating risk from a PAM perspective, we're also talking about reducing the attack surface. So we want to cut down on the number of identities that we have overall, because every identity is a potential vector of attack. So if you suddenly go into AWS and then you start creating new identities in AWS, you're increasing your attack surface. So from a PAM perspective, a best practice would be not to do that. Right? So we might advocate something like using federated, SAML-based federated single sign-on from our portal. So we log into the portal, we verify the user, the administrator, and if they're legitimately able to access AWS through our service, we let them in, but we do it using federated single sign-on. And by doing that, first of all, it's a stronger method of security of access than just basic static ID and password. But secondly, it doesn't require an identity in AWS. And so we're not increasing that attack surface. We're actually helping to maintain it at a kind of a lower state, if you will. The other thing is that these IAM tools by these cloud providers, they tend to be specific to the cloud provider. So the AWS IAM tools help you in an AWS environment. They don't help you if you're multi-cloud. And a lot of our customers are going multi-cloud, either because it makes sense from a project or an application perspective, or they're hedging their bets and putting multiple applications in multiple clouds, or maybe it's just a business-based reason. Whatever the reason, if they're going multi-cloud, you may find that from an IT and a security perspective, you're now having to deal with IAM capabilities, IAM solutions and applications that are different across the different clouds. And they may not be consistent. They may have different capabilities. So you've got to kind of tackle that. Now, when it comes to privileged access management, you want to deal with a vendor that has a solution that crosses all of these clouds. So it gives you this single pane of glass, this single method of applying robust privileged access management controls across all of them consistently from a single interface, ideally, so that you don't have these issues that you're dealing with. And also, we're not just dealing with IAM security of the cloud platform. The PAM vendor also needs to deal with IAM security of the virtual machines, the instances, the Windows and Linux systems that are running in that cloud platform. You've got to protect those as well. And typically, these cloud providers do not go deep into that ecosystem at that level.
Got it. Okay. So we've talked about a lot of different things here. But what I want to get back to is kind of the original title or premise of this session, which is modern privileged access management. Is a vault enough? So we've talked about the two sides of the coin. There's vaulting and there's privilege elevation. For modern PAM, is doing one and not the other, is that enough?
Is that enough? That's kind of a leading question there, because it really depends on the organization. I think any organization should be doing a risk assessment. They should be determining what assets do I have, how important are they, what's their value, what's the risk around each one of those assets of being compromised, and then they make their own risk tolerance assessment based on that. What do they need to protect them? But that was kind of a general response. I would say that that you really do need both. You can get away with a vault. It can be an easy on-ramp. Privileged access management is not it's not a Band-Aid. It really is a journey. It's a journey over time, and it may take time, because whichever way you look at it, PAM can be very complicated, which is why if you go for a PAM as a service solution, it may be easier on you because a lot of that is in the cloud, it's hosted, you don't need to bother with the infrastructure. But irrespective of that, the vault may be the easy on-ramp. It may get you a certain amount of risk mitigation early on. You can get some wins with that. You can get people rallying behind you. It can offer a certain level of protection. But I would advocate, again, that if you're also subscribing to best practices for security, such as zero trust or zero standing privileges, you really do need a least privilege approach to PAM. And the vault isn't going to give you that. It's the privilege elevation, the other side of the coin, where you've got that machine where the crown jewels live. You're protecting that. You're enabling it to protect itself. You've got the controls on the box itself. That, and also the logging in with minimum rights, not logging in as root or administrator, right? Because that's full privilege. That's not least privilege. So you really do need both sides of those, but you can phase it out. It's a maturity model. You can get benefits over time, and maybe the vault is the right way to go initially if you're a little stuck.
Okay, great. Well, Tony, thanks for joining us and lending your cybersecurity evangelist insights. Really appreciate it. And thank you to everyone for joining us here at RSA Conference 2021. To learn more about this topic around is vaulting enough, you can visit our microsite, which is vault.centrify.com. Thank you.
Thanks.
Make sure to subscribe to our podcast and share it with your friends and colleagues. And get all the latest information at cyberhubpodcast.com.